welcome back to Between the Pages. I'm your host, Grace Randolph, and we're coming to you from Midtown Comics in Times Square. And joining me once again is Alan Kistler for another episode of Comics to Movies. So we've pretty much covered this summer, so we want to look forward. And something people have been talking a lot about is X-Men First Class 2.
Right.
Or as it's going to be called, X-Men Days of Future Past.
Very notorious title. It's, I mean, that's such a famous story. We'll have to see how they interpret it.
It's a time-jumping story.
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about Magneto. But the big thing is that the rumor is that they might bring in the current cast because they're going to have this first-class group travel to the future and maybe meet them.
Right.
My mind would explode in happiness if Michael Fassbender were to talk to Ian McKellen.
That could be fantastic. that could
right?
absolutely be fantastic.
I will be there.
No. I mean, Ian McKellen, I remember just being so overjoyed when he was cast.
Yeah.
You know, you have this Shakespearean actor playing what is a very Shakespearean powerful role, like one of the iconic villains of comic books.
So let's start out, because I think Ian McKellen is such a different Magneto than in the comics. Right?
I mean, that's the thing. There have been a couple different Magnetos in the comics.
So let's discuss. So Magneto, he's introduced in X-Men #1.
Yeah, right off the bat, the archenemy, the guy who will become the archenemy, is in issue 1. So, you know, they looked out. And Magneto is originally supposed to be an understandable villain, but not sympathetic. You get that his point of view is basically, okay, Xavier sees us as mutants, as anomalies in humanity who have to live with humanity. I see us as a different race. We're Homo superior as opposed to Homo sapien. And we're the next step in evolution, we should be in charge.
Totally.
And, I mean, on a very base level, you get it.
Also, I think when X-Men was first introduced, it was a lot more simplistic than it is today.
Absolutely.
It was not these huge, today it has huge undertones of racism and bigotry, but not so much when it started.
Right, I mean, originally the X-Men show up and they're really just another superhero team. And then it's with issue 4, we start including the idea of, oh, people don't like mutants in general, and then
because they're mutants,
right? And then by issue 10, we've seen quite a few examples of racism.
Oh, that quickly though. That's
I mean, within a year, we were seeing the Sentinels being created out of fear and paranoia of what does the mutant race represent. But again, it was trickled over the course of that first year. It wasn't immediately, the world hates and fears us, and we must bond together. It really just seemed like another superhero team.
Yeah, they were fighting an evil version of themselves, so that's why Magneto was almost the evil version of Professor Xavier.
Right. I mean, in just Magneto's second appearance, he has the Brotherhood with him.
Yeah. So to me, Magneto's interesting because he reminds me of Loki, and that he's almost like an anti-hero sometimes. He's the villain that you kind of want to reform. And
that's the thing that came out stronger later. Like I said, originally we get his point of view, but he's still very much a villain. And his initial adventures, he's flat out trying to kill the X-Men, or take over the world, or take over this country, which he will then turn into an army to take over other parts of the world. And
he has awesome powers.
Yeah, and he's got these incredible powers. He's also apparently a geneticist, because later on in Roy Thomas's run, you'll see him like creating his own mutates in the Savage Land. Like
and then they're like, that's Mr. Sinister's job, and he sues Magneto for infringement.
Basically. It was really in the late 70s when Chris Claremont starts taking the X-Men into what a lot of people say are their glory days, with characters like Nightcrawler and Wolverine and Colossus and Storm, that Chris Claremont starts going into what is Magneto's past, and that's when we learn about Auschwitz.
Which was a very smart idea.
Yeah, it's a fantastic idea. And now, also Chris Claremont wanted to set up the idea that eventually Magneto could reform and maybe even take over the X-Men for Xavier.
And he did for a period of time, right?
Right. I mean, Claremont's original idea was that Xavier would die, and Magneto, having by this time realized how he did go too far and he had become a villain, would try to reform himself by becoming the new guiding force of the X-Men. Marvel said no, so Xavier didn't die, and
Chris Claremont's like sitting, he's like, this is going to be brilliant. He orchestrates this whole thing, he submits it, and they're like, no. Well, at what point do they divide into their almost like the Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. of the mutant kind movement? Because that's what they've evolved into.
I really think that came about in the 90s. After Magneto had gone evil again, the 90s writers had a much more, stronger idea of the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King dichotomy, and so they started really pushing it. It's also at this time the X-Men gain a whole new wave of popularity, because in the 90s you get the cartoon.
Yeah.
And the cartoon series, from the beginning, tries to make Magneto a sympathetic villain where, okay, he's killing people, and that's not right. We kind of get it. We get where he's coming from, and we get that this isn't done so much out of a need to rule the world as it is that he's that hurt and he's this scared.
And he has a different ideological viewpoint.
Right,
yeah.
right. And he is kind of traumatized.
So Magneto's like, his timeline is just all over the place. He's up and down. He's a yo-yo of good and bad. So I think something that would be helpful, let's point out like good stories to read about him. My favorite is Age of Apocalypse. Age of Apocalypse was when I was first introduced to him.
Right.
That'll always be my Magneto. I always feel he belongs with Rogue to some degree. I like that relationship. I know a lot of you people think it's ridiculous because you think he's too old, but I'm telling you, he's not.
Well, I mean, and Magneto actually was de-aged in the 70s.
Yeah.
Like circumstances, as sometimes happens in comics, de-aged him back to being about 30.
Yeah. So he's not all wrinkly. Everybody, I said this before, and everyone's like, he's so old, that's disgusting, Grace, and I don't think that's the case. So I think Age of Apocalypse is a great run to pick up.
It's a really fun run. It's an alternate reality where Xavier isn't alive to form the X-Men, and the world kind of goes to hell, and Magneto, in the absence of Xavier, and with confronting genuine, unapologetic evil, he actually becomes a force for good. A more violent force than
very
Xavier
different
ever
X-Men,
was.
yeah.
Right. But he is a force for good. No, I think the Age of Apocalypse is fantastic stuff.
What if people want to pick up like the Asteroid M? Where's that? Where can they get
Asteroid M shows up as early as X-Men issue 4 and 5. So, you know, in the original, if you want to see, you know, the true beginnings of Magneto and Asteroid M showing up in issue 5, you get X-Men Masterworks #1, which is the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby stories. The Magneto origin story that was done by Greg Pak is also really, really great. It goes into, you know, Magneto as a child growing up and what shaped him. And it really shows, you know, not just what shaped him, but just how terrible this time was, because Greg Pak goes into the history of the camps. That again, you get it. You know, even if you disagree with Magneto, you understand where he's coming from.
Totally. So I think those are some good stories. And also I like where Magneto is right now. I think he's in an interesting place. And also it's important to understand about Asteroid M. We bring that up. It was played in a number of times. It was in the animated series. That's where I remember it from, with their cool black and red uniforms. I always like that stuff. But Asteroid M is what Utopia is. Because Asteroid M fell out of the sky and landed off the coast of San Francisco. Right,
and first Cable used it as a base, and now it's become for a lot of the X-Men, the base of operations. It's kind of its own mutant nation, which you wrote about.
Yeah, and I think that shows the fact that oh yes, Nation X. Thank you for remembering that. Yes, I did. And the thing is, though, is that I think that underlines the parallel for how Scott Summers is evolving. He is almost going into the Magneto ideology, and Magneto is actually a member of his team.
Yeah, which is a huge change from the 80s when Magneto was joining the team around the same time that Cyclops left. And one major factor was Cyclops couldn't really be on a team where he was working with someone who'd been trying to kill him since he was 17 years old.
Now he's cool with it.
Now he's okay with it. You know, he thinks Magneto needs to be held in line. He thinks Magneto goes too far, but he gets it.
Yeah, I think, you know, Scott, I think, has had enough bad situations that maybe he understands where Magneto is coming from.
Right.
And that's what's created the current rift in the X-Men. So how about the Magneto Savage Land run?
Yeah, in the late 60s, early 70s, that's when we started exploring Magneto as a scientist, and we saw him going to the Savage Land and creating his own mutations and all this jazz. But then the Savage Land run becomes so big later because in the 90s you have him there with Rogue, and their powers aren't working, and they wind up in a romance. And he's returned to the Savage Land a few times for various things, and it's become a big part of his character. It was also a whole season worth of stories back in the X-Men 90s cartoon. So a lot of today's fans really associate him with the Savage Land as well.
And he and Rogue are usually a couple, multiple times. I stand by it. So you said the animated series he was big, but then he became huge with Ian McKellen. Everybody loved that, because that was really the first place he was in live action he was ever portrayed.
Absolutely. And again, Bryan Singer wanted to show us a villain who was understandable, so we open up the film with Magneto's story. We open up the film with Auschwitz. We don't open it up with Xavier discovering that he's telepathic. We open up the movie with Magneto's parents are being taken away from him, and he reacts. And then we jump ahead to older Magneto, where we completely get it.
What I liked about it is that Bryan Singer cast age-appropriate actors.
Yes.
No one was de-aged here. And I think by casting such strong Shakespearean actors, he set up that opposing viewpoints with Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen that is the spine of the X-Men.
Right, it wasn't just good versus evil, it was two philosophies warring.
Yes.
And Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen could bring that idea to the screen.
Yeah, and also the fact that they were once friends.
Yes.
Which I also liked at the series. I think that X2 is where Magneto was the coolest. That prison break
Fantastic.
scene
Fantastic
is
use
amazing,
of Magneto.
right?
And again, he's doing villainous things unapologetically, but you understand the greater good that he thinks he's serving.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. And also, him and Mystique are very well paired in the movies.
Yeah,
I like that. And their friendship. Ian McKellen brings a lot of joy to it, which I think people always enjoy in their villains, especially their on-screen villains.
Again, Bryan Singer wanted to remind us that although his general motives might be understandable, he's still the bad guy. You know, it's not like he's really remorseful about it's a shame that I have to take life in order to get this done. No, he's taking joy in taking out these guards.
Well, also, he feels human life is worthless.
Right.
Human life is worthless.
Right, they're in his way.
Yeah, it's us or them, and he doesn't feel I'm just evolved. He doesn't feel he's a different species. He feels he's evolved.
Right.
So,
I'm higher than them.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Then they do this. The X-Men movies kind of wane a little bit in their popularity. Bryan Singer leaves to do Superman Returns, and that just throws a huge monkey wrench. I mean, even though X-Men Last Stand grossed the most, it did the best at the box office, they decided to go with X-Men Origins Wolverine. They were going to do an X-Men Origins Magneto movie.
Right, which then evolved into First Class. And part of that was that Wolverine was received so poorly by critics and fans, they just decided...
Thank you,
Jackman. Not his fault.
Yeah,
they just decided. They just decided that you know what? Obviously, the solo films aren't working. People want X-Men to have a team. Let's do a team. So we got First Class.
Well, it's interesting. I think Michael Fassbender has shades of Ian McKellen, but I don't see him growing up to be Ian McKellen.
I mean, that's one thing. Like, First Class very quickly went from being a prequel to really being in its own universe. Because even if you just look at the plot line...
That's how I feel, yeah.
Even if you look at the plot line, there's no way that this is the same continuity. Because it disagrees with half of what Magneto and Xavier say in just the first X-Men movie.
Oh, totally. And I also feel that they choose such a dashing actor.
Yeah.
It really plays into the romantic side of Magneto when he's a leading man. And also, I think it makes him that much harder to dislike. Everyone loved at the end of the movie when he shows up in a costume.
Right.
You know, I feel like you almost have a situation where you're like, screw the X-Men. The Brotherhood's really cool.
Which is actually why I criticized the film. I think it was so intent on making Magneto an understandable person that we forgot, but Xavier is supposed to be the good guy.
Yeah.
And Xavier actually comes off as naive to me in the film. So, I mean, X-Men First Class, if you like it, that's cool. I'm just saying that to me, it really felt like it was supposed to be titled, And Magneto Was Right.
I like that.
Because I mean, it just came off like at the end of it, I'm thinking, why am I supposed to root for Xavier in this version of events? I'm with Magneto because he seems to be justified in almost every action he takes. So I think it's a weakness with the film.
Well, also I think it's a casting problem. I think that as wonderful as James McAvoy is, I think on a charisma level he just doesn't compete with Michael Fassbender.
The story didn't let him bring enough gravitas to the table.
That's true.
You know, we didn't see Xavier's beliefs tested, or what truly brought this about.
My biggest problem, though, well, you had a problem with Magneto Was Right. I didn't like the way they depicted Mystique being a part of like a love triangle between Xavier and Magneto. I think it messes up the dual nature of that, you know, one idea versus another. Now it becomes like three friends who had like a fight.
Right.
It becomes one of those like, you know, Breakfast Club movies.
I mean, it almost makes for joining Magneto a personal slight against Xavier, of like, well, you didn't appreciate me, so I'm going to go over here, which to me is fairly weak.
And also, when you say that stuff about it being its own universe, I think that even more establishes it, because none of that is seen in the other films. With
absolutely not.
Mystique, you're not like, she's not like, oh hey Xavier, what's up? Long time no see.
Xavier isn't pained by Mystique's presence.
Yeah, yeah. So going forward, what would you like to see with Michael Fassbender in Days of Future Past?
You know, I can forgive him seeming still in the right in First Class, if in Days of Future Past we then see him take it too far. I need him to take it too far. I need it to remind us that we're supposed to root for the X-Men.
Yeah, I agree. I would also like to see the powers cut loose more. I think one of the things that makes Magneto so great is his power set. They showed it a little bit in X-Men First Class. I'd like to see in Days of Future Past, with the Sentinels being introduced, really just cut loose. I think that would be amazing. And I want to see that Fassbender McKellen conversation.